In this program, we shall be looking at the care, caution, and concern scholars had when speaking in God's name. When issues came to declaring things as obligatory or fard or wajib, or regarding certain things as haram, prohibited, scholars understood by saying something was obligatory according to Islamic law, it usually meant there was a sin attached to not doing it. And haram or prohibition implied there was a sin for committing it. The moment one is attributing a sin to something, it implies that God is going to punish. No one has the right to say God will punish you for committing or omitting a particular action or deed without the prerequisite certainty from the Quran or from the Sunnah. One had to be certain both in the meaning of the text and in the authenticity of the text that certainly God was going to punish a particular action. So therefore, it would be regarded as prohibited if committed, or if it was obligatory, it would be prohibited to omit it. In other words, an obligation to act. So to speak in God's name was a very important area that scholars were very apprehensive of. And the reason is because to make haram what Allah has already made halal was considered an act of shirk, an act of blasphemy. It was an act of giving oneself the status of being a lawgiver. No one competes with Allah. We do not make obligatory what Allah has not made obligatory. We do not prohibit what Allah has not prohibited. And so when it comes to the sin of association with Allah as lawgivers, scholars were very wary and therefore became very careful and set up elaborate systems and procedures to increase the certainty with which they would require evidence that something was prohibited or obligatory. Scholars understood that they were to submit to the will of God as revealed through His Prophet, and that Muslims were instructed to submit to the will of God, not to the will or the whims of a scholar. And so part of the purpose of Usulul Fiqh and Maqasid was to help maximize and measure the level of certainty with which a scholar could say, this is what God's will is on this topic. Scholars were also afraid of deviation and heresy or bid'ah, of blameworthy innovations in the religion, changing the religion, but doing it in the name of God. And so, because the Prophet, peace be upon him, described such innovations or heretical, blameworthy innovations as a form of misguidance, he says, Kullu bid'atin dalal, every heresy or such innovation is misguidance, and such misguidance leads to hell. Scholars tended to be very careful when they were saying things so that they didn't attribute a lie to God, that no one was lying in God's name or saying this is God's position when that really wasn't God's position. In the search for certainty regarding God's will, to find out whether from the Quran or from the Sunnah, the position of God or the intent of the Prophet, peace be upon him, whether it was to make something obligatory or just recommended, merely permissible or discouraged, or whether something was actually prohibited, there was the need to be certain regarding two very important issues: the authenticity of text and the meaning and implications of that text. It was important that people were sure that a prescription was actually from the Prophet or from Allah. They also wanted to be sure that the prescription was clearly understood and not open to alternative meanings. Scholars wanted to be sure that the meanings they had really represented the understanding that was intended by the lawgiver. And so, in an attempt to maximize the certainty with which they interpreted texts, they tried to look elsewhere, looking at the practice of the Sahaba, looking at the objectives and intents of the law, and various other ways of reaching a greater level of certainty regarding what the will of God actually was. So they were afraid of speaking in God's name, and they put up a system to ensure that they did not make prohibitions where the law had not really prohibited, or created obligations where the law did not warrant such.